1979, a guy called Marcello Truzzi, an Italian skeptic, came out with a statement, and he said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. This is my task here, is that I feel that the world that we're interested in, and the lectures we do, and the events we do here, are all very good, but you have to deal with facts. You have to deal with information. You have to deal with citing peer-reviewed papers to support your details. To stand and make sweeping statements is not going to convince anybody except the audience you're standing behind. If we are to change the paradigm, we have to start getting scientific. We have to use the scientific information and take it out there to the skeptics, which is what I do. I don't just lecture to you guys because you're interested in the subject. I'll lecture to anybody. It's profoundly important. Now, what I decided to do here was I've changed my speech completely. I'm going to be doing quite a different talk. And what I'm hoping is that I'll then move into the other talks. I've got around about an hour and a half, so we've got time to expand. Now, the first question is, how many of you have come across my work? Right, a number, which is quite interesting. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and go back to my first book, because I think it very much fits in with the subject matter of my two previous speakers. And I think it's quite important we review this. And I'll be going through my cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, but I'll be doing it specifically in the light of the information I now know that I didn't know 15, 16 years ago when I first started writing that book. Okay? So, if we get movement. On the side, it needs to be turned on. Ah, right, on. Can you,
Yeah, it's... There we go.
All right.
It's on
Okay.
now, sorry.
Okay. All right, what happened there then? Is it me?
It might be you. Oh, look. Oh, it might be because of the...
Oh, where I'm standing.
Is, yeah.
All right, okay. I will relocate myself.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Right, still not. No? No, does anybody listen to my podcast and things? We call this the Archons. It's an Archon effect. We had it happen only a few days ago when I was doing an interview. It's magic.
Okay. I can flick through this.
Okay.
I'll get you a fresh battery. And
Okay. Oh no, it's worked for you. Isn't that amazing? What is it about me?
Try once more. Press the down one.
Right. Okay.
There we go.
Right. Okay. No, I just want to make sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm very fascinated by time. And if any of you have read my book, The Labyrinth of Time, you know I go into the science of time and the science of time perception and how the brain processes the idea of time. And again, I recently wrote a book on J.B. Priestley and about his particular angle on time. But what I'm particularly intrigued in is the way in which we seem to see things in places. Has anybody come across the 11/11 phenomenon? Okay. Now, the 11/11 phenomenon, I would argue as much as anything, it's to do with the way we perceive things. Our distant ancestors would be programmed, they'd be living on the plains of Africa. And effectively what they needed to do was to be able to see objects coming towards them. So therefore anything that was standing up in the distance could be a predator. So therefore we are programmed to see things standing up. So when you see 11/11, what you do is you notice it. It's called attention bias. Your attention is drawn to that fact. It doesn't mean that it's significant. It means you're just noticing it. That was my hypothesis and that was my theory. Until one day, my wife turned around and said, "You have missed completely the most peculiar 11/11 coincidence in your life." And I said, "What?" And she said, "What was the title of the Dutch edition of your first book?" And it was called 11/11/11. And 11/11/11 in Dutch means life after life after life. Now, why does that mean of its significance? Well, there's the 11/11/11 book title, okay? And I was seeing 11/11 everywhere, and I was really intrigued by this. And it meant that it was something telling me that I was on the right route. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I used to be an area human resources manager for Nuffield Hospitals in the north of England. And I had a great responsibility, well, not a great responsibility, it was a responsibility for all human resources aspects of 12 hospitals across the north of England. And I used to spend an awful lot of time driving round. Okay? Now, one thing over the years I've done is I love my music. So on my phone now, I have around about 20,000 MP3s. And in the years gone by, I had a little machine called an Arcos player. And an Arcos player, the particular Arcos players I liked, had a huge amount of memory. So I had about 16,000 MP3s on this particular Arcos player. Okay? Now, I used to, when I was traveling around, I'd have the Arcos player on at all times on random play. No problem. Roll back, 1988, I think it was. I go into a record shop and I buy an album. I bought a CD. And with the CD came a free CD, which was actually given out with the album. I went home and I was then with my then wife, common law wife, Jenny. Got home, next day, next afternoon, or whatever it was, I'm listening to the free CD. And I get to the second or third track. And a track called Round of Blues comes on by an American singer-songwriter called Sean Colvin. And it was probably one of the most stunning events of my life because I knew that song. I knew that song quite precisely. Now, if anybody checks it out, it's very happy, it's very bouncy. But suddenly I called Jenny in from the kitchen and I said, can we go to our solicitors this weekend? And she said, why? And I said, I want to change my will. And she said, why? And I said, because I want that song played at my funeral. And she turns around to me and she goes, what? You know, as women tend to look at me and think I'm absolutely crazy. And she gives me this withering look and says, why? I said, I don't know. For some reason, that's my death song and I want it played. I then had peculiar images in my mind because if you hear it, it's got quite dissonant beats and I could imagine people carrying the coffin and bouncing up and down, a little like, you know, the Ministry of Silly Walks kind of thing with a coffin. And I thought this isn't going to work terribly well, but I was insistent, but I didn't know why. So, when sadly that relationship came to an end and I met my present wife, or my wife, Penny, one of the first things I did when we got together was I said the same thing. I said, you need to know that this is the song that's going to be played at my funeral. Now, we were in a particularly new relationship though, and of course she really looks at me as if I'm completely crazy. You know, what am I getting into, this nutter? So, I played her the song, and she had the same reaction, said it's a very happy song, but I said, no, it needs to be played at my funeral. Okay, now let's roll forward to when I was working for Nuffield Hospitals. We're probably talking here about 2002, 2003 maybe. The Arcos players playing in my car. 1 in 16,000 chance of any track coming up. It's a cold, misty day on the M62, the motorway that crosses between Yorkshire and Lancashire. And I was positioning from my home in, I think it was, I don't know where I was at the time, maybe Harrogate, and I was positioning to our Chester Hospital for a big meeting the day after. I'm driving down the M62 near a place called Milne Row, if anybody knows it. It's where it starts to dip down again from the heights and it starts to come down. As I'm driving down, the next record comes on. It's Round of Blues. 1 in 16,000 chance. That track had never, ever, ever been played. Ever. So 1 in 16,000 chance. And suddenly, subliminally, in my head, I thought, that's significant. There's a significance here. I then found my left hand turning the wheel from the middle lane into the slow lane. As I did so, the lorry in front of me had a load of crash barriers on it. The crash barriers came loose and crashed into the road. They would have hit my car. I'd have been killed. Round of Blues would have been the last thing I would ever have heard in my life. That is why it is my death song. It's because the last time I lived this life, or one of the previous times I lived this life, that's when I died. Okay? Now, let's look at the lyrics of this song. I particularly pick out, okay, here we go again, another round of blues. Several miles ago, I set down my angel shoes on a lost highway. For a better view, now in my mind's eye, all roads lead to you. Another reference, highway, roads. So wherever you go, you better take care of me this time. If you're going to go, remember me and all this time. We had our bitter cheer and sweet sorrow. We lost a lot today, but we'll get it back tomorrow. I hear the sound of wheels. I would have been hearing wheels. My car would have squealed because I'd have tried to avoid them. I know the rainbow's end, death. I see the lights in a fat city. I feel a love again. So wherever you go, you better take care of me this time. Now that is absolutely stunning, beyond any comprehension that I can begin. I tweeted that. I regularly post this on my Facebook wall, and I regularly tweet it because it's such an extraordinary event. Suzanne Vega, if anybody knows Suzanne Vega, the American singer-songwriter, she picked up on it, she retweeted it. Suzanne Vega is a friend of Sean Colvin's. I was desperate to just make in contact with Sean Colvin about this song to ask why she wrote it the way she did. What was the circumstances by which she wrote this song? I'm still waiting for a reply, but one day I know that I'm going to get a response. But I don't think it's anything to do with Sean Colvin. It's to do with my specific life, my perception of this reality. So move on now. So what do I mean? How can this happen? How can I have a precognition or those kind of sets of circumstances unless it tells us something quite precise about the nature of reality and the nature of your reality and everybody else's reality? So this is where we go again. Right. Synchronicities. How many times in your life have you had synchronicities take place? How many times have you thought, my friend's going to phone, and it rings? Okay? I'll give you one synchronicity, and I'm not sure if I do it in this presentation, because literally, I loaded this earlier on. But in the book, Man and Time, that I showed before, I needed when I was researching the first book, I needed a copy of Man and Time, that book, for my own references. I went down to my local library, Horsham in West Sussex, to order the book. West Sussex Library didn't have a copy of it, so they decided that I would have to order it from the British Library in Boston Spa in North Yorkshire. I order the library book, and then I wait for 3 weeks for it to arrive. One afternoon, I get a phone call from Horsham Library to say that Man and Time has arrived. Okay? I then, that weekend, remember all these variables that are taking place here, that weekend, I go down and pick the library book up from the library. I then go upstairs, leave it in my study, and then one evening, a few days later, I'm about to go to bed, and I don't know if you guys, but I have to be reading all the time. Even if it means reading the back of a cornflake packet, I have to be reading. So I picked up the book to take it up with me. I take it to bed, and I flick through the pages at random, and I settle on one particular page. And I start reading the page, and on the page it says, Priestley's trying to explain relativity, and he's trying to explain the relativity of time, and how it is that time is relative to your own position, and the way in which when you are seeing a star in the distance, you are seeing as it was hundreds or thousands of years ago. You're not seeing as it is now. And he says, I'll now give you an example of another writer. Now, Priestley wrote that book in 1963. He then references a book by a guy called Coleman, written in 1957. And there's a little box with this statement on. And the book is called Relativity for Laymen. And in it, he writes, imagine that on the night of the 17th of March, 2000, there is an explosion on the star Betelgeuse. I turned round to my wife and I said, what year is it? And I get the crazed look of, well, it's 2000. I said, okay, what day is it? She said, it's the 17th of March, as you know. And I said, what time of day is it? She said, it's the evening. I said, so what is the statistical chance of all those variables for me to be reading that on the exact date that Coleman chose? The exact date. He had every single date from the beginning of time till the end of time. And each day, it was the evening of that day. That made me go, wow, this is just bizarre beyond belief. But then I start researching my new book. And I needed to have some information about mitochondria. I was interested because mitochondrial DNA is carried through the female line. And I needed to do some research on this. Now, I have a vast collection of books, but I realized that the only person I know that was likely to write about mitochondrial DNA was Richard Dawkins. And I have all Richard Dawkins' books, believe it or not. And I went to my bookcase. Now, one thing I never do is dog-ear book pages. It's something I do not do. I hate it. I like my books to be pristine. I take out his book, The Blind Watchmaker. And I take the book out, and I notice, to my absolute amazement, that there's one page that's dog-eared. I then remembered dog-earing that page 15 years before on the beach in a little island called Symi in Greece when I went up to lunch. And I remember at the time, I was in Pedi, okay? And I remember at the time thinking, why did you do that? I just distinctly remember, why did you do that? I opened the page, read down it, and there was mitochondria. I then went through all of Richard Dawkins' other books. It is the only reference he makes to mitochondria in his whole writings. That was my earlier self giving me a clue. He was going, you're not going to get this now, but in 15 years' time, this will shake you, and it will make you realize where you need to take your new book. And that's exactly what I did. Because I was fascinated, we'll flip through that, and we'll flick through that, because we can talk a little bit about synchronicity. We'll go back to that. But synchronicity as well, if anybody's interested and thinks that synchronicity isn't taken seriously by science, you're probably aware of the fact that Wolfgang Pauli, the quantum physicist who wrote Pauli's exclusion principle, worked with Gustav Jung on synchronicity. And I wrote a paper on this many years ago. Pauli was fascinated by this kind of the way in which in quantum physics you get coincidences taking place in synchronicities. I might touch upon some of these. I've touched upon them in some of my books, and I've also touched upon some of the ideas of how subatomic particles seem to be brought into existence when humanity seems to think, is there a subatomic particle there? An example is the muon. The muon was a hypothetical particle until one day they thought maybe it exists. And within a few days it had been discovered. And a guy called E.E.I.I. Raby, who was an American quantum physicist, actually said when it appeared, who ordered that? Because this is the idea that we collapse the wave function of reality to actually create this world around us. But I'll be doing the science of this later, so I'm not just making these extreme statements, I do the science. So what is really happening with reality here? Well, does anybody know about superposition of subatomic particles? If you take two subatomic particles and you put them in the same quantum state, they become entangled. What then happens is, if you then place one of the subatomic particles 1,000,000 miles away, and you do something to the first particle, the other particle reacts instantaneously. It's called strange action at a distance. This was why Einstein had such problems with quantum physics. And in 1937, he wrote a paper with Podolsky and Rosen called the EPR paper. And it's known as the EPR paradox. And he was trying to disprove this idea that subatomic particles could communicate. Back in 1964, I think it was, an Irish physicist called John Bell, who was at CERN, wrote a paper doing the mathematics of it and suggested that Einstein was wrong and that subatomic particles could communicate, but it was only theoretical. 1981, in the most amazing experiment in the history of the world, which I guarantee none of you know about, Alain Aspect and a guy called Dalibard at the University of Paris Optics session did an experiment to prove beyond all doubt that subatomic particles at a lower level can communicate instantaneously. Now, imagine the scenario, the first moments of the Big Bang. The Big Bang, we came from a point particle, a point, which every single subatomic particle that exists in the universe now was in that. It was all entangled at that point. So when we say that there's distance out here, when we turn around and we say that I'm here and you're there is no here or there. Space is a mystery. Effectively, just think for a second. If all the planets and all the stars and all the galaxies suddenly disappeared, where does space go? What is space? Space is empty. Space is nothing. This is what Leibniz argued about many, many years ago. And it's a very important point. Space is the objects that are in it. If there is no object in space, space does not exist. Or maybe it does. It's a field, who knows? But the point is still made. So here we go. So really, is space empty? Anybody heard of David Bohm? Okay. David Bohm, very, very famous quantum physicist, fell foul of the McCarthy witch hunts in the 1950s in America. Came over and ended up working, I think, at Goldsmiths College or Queen Mary College in London. David Bohm was one of the most amazing quantum physics thinkers ever. He wrote a book called Science and the Implicate Order. And he argued that space is not empty, it's full, a plenum as opposed to a vacuum, and it is the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. The universe is not separate from this cosmic sea of energy. He argued that there's something called the implicate and explicate orders. Again, everything I say here, go up and check it yourself. Don't take my word for it. I'm not making this up, but you go and read it. The implicate and explicate orders. This is the idea that everything is enfolded in itself within the universe. Everything that's in the universe out there is also in you. So the Andromeda galaxy is in the tear in your eye. And the reason they use this, they use holograms. If you take a holographic image and you break it up, it's not like a jigsaw where you break it up and each jigsaw piece has a little bit of the image. If you break up a holographic image, each bit of the image actually contains the whole image. Now that's astounding, but it's a fact. And this is how they believe the universe works. And when we were talking earlier on about the simulation argument, this is one of the bases of the simulation argument, why they believe that this is a simulation. And I will touch upon that later if I get time. So, let's start looking deeply now. Have you ever heard of the brain in a vat thought experiment? Okay, it was put forward, I think, by John Searle, an American philosopher. And the idea is, imagine that your brain, is taken out of your body and it's placed within a vat and it's floating in a vat. Feeding in, oh no, this is different. Let's go back to this one. This is even more interesting. Sorry, my apologies there. Because I've not done this talk for a long time. This is even more intriguing. This is the idea of how we feel that subatomic particles are separate. The idea that there's an electron over there and there's an electron over here. By the way, in the late 1950s, one of the Americans' top quantum physicists, Richard Feynman, turned around and said that why is it that all electrons are identical? How is it that you cannot distinguish electrons? You know what he said? He said, because there's only one electron in the universe, and that's traveling at infinite speed. This is one of the top American particle physicists. Now, this is not the guy down the pub. This is not New Age wacko. This is the guy that actually discovered the problems with the O-rings when the Challenger disaster took place. This is serious stuff. So the idea, well, how can we believe that everything is one single particle? Well, let's look at it. It's a great thought experiment. And again, it was David Bohm. And he said, imagine a scenario that we are suddenly in contact with an alien civilization billions of light years away, but somehow we can instantaneously communicate with them. And we want to give them an idea of what our reality is like. Now, why they do this particular thing is crazy, but it gives the idea. He said, what they would do is, we would put two cameras, either side of an aquarium. So this is the thing at the top here. And there'll be a fish swimming in the aquarium. And we send the signal to our alien friends, both signals. So the aliens are getting two signals coming through. But they get confused because they think they're seeing two different things. They're seeing two pictures of an aquarium with this thing moving around, but it's moving in different ways. So they think there are two things taking place. But of course, the reality is, it is a single object being perceived in different ways. And this is what Bohm argued takes place with reality. Reality is far more complex than we can ever imagine. Okay? So bearing that in mind, we will try down here again. Oh, we've gone backwards, sorry. Okay, so there is a reason for all this. I am pulling things together. People who know me know that I will scatter stuff, but it all come together, believe me. Precognition. I'll guarantee there are people in this room that have had precognitive events in your life. Have you ever thought why and how? How can you see the future? The future hasn't happened yet. And yet you see it, you perceive it. You perceive it in dreams. You have déjà vu sensations, where you see the future. Can it really be that human beings can't see the future? Well, I've been spending many, many years looking at classic cases of precognition. And this is not the guy down the pub again. These are serious things that have been proven. Look at that. This is an album cover by a gangster rap band called Coup. As you can see, Bootsy Collins or Bootsy Barrett, I never remember, has recreated 9/11. Because obviously they, being a rap band, really want to be revolutionary. And they're making a joke about it. And he's implying that somehow he was responsible for the explosions. It's great, isn't it? Very accurate. In fact, I spent a lot of time trying to find this image up here. Because I remember when 9/11 took place, I remember seeing a particular video of a man on the streets of New York, and he was drinking a cup of coffee, and I remember him putting it down on the top of a car. And as he did so, he ducks because the plane goes in. And I was particularly interested at the angle of that filming. Because the angle of that filming is exactly the same as the angle there. Now, here's the rub. That album cover was designed and printed in April of 2001. Months before 9/11 took place. Now, you can turn around and say, it's a coincidence. It was chance that this guy decided to do this. What chance that he decided on the Twin Towers? Chance that he decided on getting the explosions in exactly the same place? If you look at that, they're in exactly the same place. This is not just a duplication. This is not him doing anything. He didn't know why he did it. He didn't know why he designed it. I believe he did it because he had future memory. He'd either dreamt it or he'd subliminally seen such a powerful image that is now burned upon every single person who was alive that day and witnessed it. We can see it in our mind's eye. It was the most iconic thing that ever happened in our lifetimes. So therefore it would resonate in some way and people would remember it. But what is particularly intriguing about this was I believe he wasn't remembering 9/11, the event. He was remembering seeing it on television. Because he wasn't there. He saw that image on television, and that's why that image is so precise. And again, if anybody's interested, this is an application of some of the work of somebody called J.W. Dunn, John William Dunn, who was an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer. I won't go into Dunn's background at the moment, but he wrote a book in 1927 called An Experiment with Time. And he argued that we all dream, and in our dreams they're precognitive. And in our dreams we have, our brains create this whole scenario, but within our dreams there are precognitions. And they're coded and they're mixed up with our subconscious fears and everything else. But it happens to us, and he suggested you keep a diary, and a dream diary, of what takes place. So here we have an idea and a theory about what takes place. And I'll touch upon Dunn's ideas again in a second, because like you guys, I don't know what the next picture is going to be, because I haven't done this for a long time. Okay, here is more images from 9/11. 9/11 wasn't just Bootsy Collins. These are drawings by an English guy. Now, if I go forward again. Let's go back. Let's see if I can go forward, and if I've got the right image now. I haven't, okay. I'll explain. This guy used to have precognitive dreams. His name escapes me at the moment. It will come to me in a second. And what he used to do was, he would have the dreams, and then he would draw what he'd seen. But he knew that people would consider that he was making it up. So what he used to do, he lives in Sudbury in North London. And what he used to do is he used to take himself to the local NatWest Bank. And he would have the drawing, and he'd have somebody take a photograph of him. You know, in banks they have the date and the time in the background. And he'd stand there with the picture underneath. These are one of his pictures. That's the picture he shows above of showing the Twin Towers. He's then got a picture down here of an aircraft. And he says, plane hits buildings. Okay? This guy is even more intriguing. This is a picture he drew, again, showing Concorde with its back on fire in France. He's even got the French flag. That was painted, again, a few months before Concorde crashed. Do you remember the Concorde incident? The back was on fire. Now, I was contacted by somebody who showed me a fax message he sent to British Airways about 6 months before Concorde crashed. University lecturer. He contacted me after my first book was published because he said that he had for most of his life precognitive events. One dream he had, dreamt he was in a hotel, and he's looking out through the window of the hotel, and as he sees it, Concorde goes past with its back on fire. And then he sees it crash. And then, which is even weirder, he then hears voices in his head speaking in German, turning round and saying, "Oh my God, what's happened to us?" I don't know if you know, but when Concorde crashed, the people who were on the plane were German, even though it happened in France. And this guy knew they were German because he heard the voices in his head. Now again, Concorde was the safest aircraft ever. There had never been an incident with Concorde before. He was so worried about this incident, he actually sent a fax message to British Airways. And I've got a copy of this. I can't find it, but I still have a copy of it. Where he turns around and he says, "Concorde's going to crash somewhere foreign soon. You need to do something about it." But of course, British Airways didn't, because if they reacted to every single strange message they get, they'd never fly. But intriguing. So there are 2 or 3 people here. So what is going on? How can people see the future? It's all right to just say, "Oh, well, it's something magical." There has to be a process. There has to be a mechanism. To just say that you're precognitive makes no sense to me. I take a very scientific viewpoint on these things. I want to know why it happens. I want to be able to take my evidence to the scientists and say, "Look, argue with this. Don't just dismiss what I'm saying. Don't say it's the law of large numbers," which is what you'll normally find. No, this is the reasoning. The reasoning is, to explain this, is that, well, around the world there are millions of people all dreaming. And you have micro dreams during the night. So you're going to have 20 or 30 billion dreams every night. So therefore there will be somebody somewhere who will have a dream about a plane crashing. And the next day a plane crashes. Apparently that's the explanation. Yeah, if somebody has a dream about a plane crashing, but if somebody turns around and says, "Concorde is going to crash in France with its back on fire," that is now starting to stretch statistics. And I always argue with people about this and say, I do understand statistics. I actually studied them at postgraduate level on the School of Economics, so I do understand statistics. Okay? So this is interesting. So, déjà vu. How many people here have déjà vu experiences? Okay. How many of you have precognitive déjà vu experiences? Okay. Do you know what the explanation for déjà vu is? It's called the Efron hypothesis, and it was put forward in 1962 by a guy called Robert Efron. That's a surprise, isn't it? The way people are always named after the things they invent. You read any book on psychology at the moment, it will turn around and say that that's proven. And you talk to your friends about them, and they'll turn around and they'll say, "Yeah, no, it's unexplained, it's been explained." Absolute nonsense. It's not been explained. His explanation is called the visual pathways. And it's the idea that we have 2 hemispheres of our brain, and the peripheral vision of each eye feeds one or other of the hemispheres to give us stereo vision in both areas. The argument, Efron's idea, is that your non-dominant hemisphere processes an image a split second before your dominant hemisphere. The image then crosses what's called the corpus callosum into your dominant hemisphere, where you then see the image where you're located. So you get this kind of double effect, where you see it and you see it again. That takes about 0.5 of a second. Now, when I've had déjà vu experiences, I'm not having a 0.5 of a second thinking, "Oh, I've seen that, I just saw it." I have the overall sensation of standing here in my clothes, talking to, if I had one now, I'd go, "I've stood here in Birmingham watching those inflatables over there, and I've done it before." And you have that kind of shiver down your spine, where you go, "Woof, this is just really strange." That's significant to me. Efron's idea works on visual pathways. Around about 6 or 7 years ago, a guy called Akira O'Connor at the University of Leeds, who's on the Chris Moulon group who are researching déjà vu, actually found the people who are born blind have déjà entendu, or is it déjà sente, already heard, where they hear something and they hear it again. That makes the visual pathways theory right out of the water. I much prefer my associate, Dr. Arthur Funkhauser's position on this, which is called the dream theory of déjà vu. You've had a dream recently, and it's precognitive, but you've forgotten it. And then you start to live what you've just dreamt. And you have that feeling of recognition, because that's how it works, isn't it? You go, when? And in fact, the definition of déjà vu by a guy called Vernon Neppe, who's based at the Pacific Institute in Seattle, that is the definition. It's a memory, a memory of an indefinable place in your past, and you don't know when, but you know you've done it before. So, if we believe that déjà vu sensations, or literally, as I would like to call it, déjà vécu, and I'll come to that in a second, is literally that you have sensed this before, what does this prove? Some people have turned around to me and said, oh, it's proof of past lives. It proves that you've been here as somebody else. Well, I'll guarantee if you have a déjà vu sensation now, that's not proof that you've lived in Victorian times. You'd be sitting there in Victorian clothing, surrounded by Victorian people. You have a déjà vu sensation now. You are in your body, looking out of your eyes, wearing your clothes, perceiving this now. So it is something intensely personal to do with you as a consciousness. It's got nothing to do with past lives. Okay? I can explain in my hypothesis, in my overall, I can explain past lives quite straightforwardly. But for this specific thing, this is you remembering who you are. So where are we going with this? Well, we were talking about time earlier on, and I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time. And in fact, I'll be in the studios to do the audible version of A Labyrinth of Time in 3 or 4 weeks' time. My first book, the book I'm talking about now, by the way, came out in 2006. It's now sold 50, 60,000 copies worldwide, and it's in, last time, I think, 9 languages. So it's proven quite popular. So check it out if you're not aware of it. Okay, but everything I'm talking about here in the book, I go into the nth degree detail about this. I give you references to the academic papers and the research. Remember, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. Okay, so the idea is, how does time work? Well, according to various researchers, and specifically the research of a guy called Julian Barber, who's an academic at the University of Cambridge, who wrote a few years ago a book called The End of Time, time is sliced. And again, if any quantum physicist or anybody here is involved in this, you know that what I'm talking about here is Minkowski time. It's called block time. So when you see something moving, if you look on a piece of film and you see a green dot moving, what is in fact happening is it's a series of images that your brain puts together as movement. This is called the critical fusion facility of the eye. You see a series of static images which your brain, your visual cortex, puts together to give you the illusion of movement. It works in exactly the same way as film. Okay, so you are now scanning me, and you're scanning my movements to give the illusion of movement. But imagine something that critical fusion facility of the eye, I think it's 24 images per second. Imagine your perception changed. Imagine instead of taking one image every 24th of a second, you suddenly start taking images every second. Suddenly your worldview starts to change, doesn't it? Suddenly what you see is completely different. Imagine then a scenario of a critical fusion facility of 5 hours. What would you see in this room? You wouldn't see individual people. You'd see these kind of smeared out people walking in around and mixing together. But there's no arbitrary reason why 24 images to the second is the way that reality should be perceived. Just like there's no reason, what I call electromagnetic chauvinism. There's no reason why the reality that you're seeing is the actual reality, because you're seeing a very, very tiny section of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light is tiny. And I did an analysis in one of my books of just how tiny it is. If you take it from radio waves to gamma rays, from one end to the other, and imagine that the whole electromagnetic spectrum is the Mississippi River. And it starts in a little lake in Minnesota, and it ends up going out in the Gulf of Mexico. The world you believe you see is 1.5 inches, about 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. That's what we believe is the visual world. Come on, there is so much we can't see, there's so much we cannot perceive. Let's not pretend. It's electromagnetic chauvinism. Bees see the world in a different way, depending upon how fast you move, depending upon your metabolic level, will depend upon how you perceive reality. This is an example of the moon and the Earth. From a creature looking at a year long, the Earth is a cylinder. The Earth is not a sphere. It's a cylinder moving through space. The Earth is going round, the moon is going round the Earth like a spring. But that's how a creature using this would see it. Has anybody ever seen the film Interstellar? Remember the Tesseract sequence? It's when he's the bookcase and he pushes the book out and he sees his daughter. Do you know why that looks so weird? It's because Christopher Nolan, the director, was trying to get across the idea of, I'm talking about here, how time really works, how you can see time from outside time, from the fifth dimension. And that's what he's doing. He's looking in at his daughter's life with all of them. They call it the Tesseract sequence for a very good reason. Basic geometry, point particle. You move a point particle along, you get a line, don't you? If you then go at a right angle from that, you get a square, don't you? If you then go from a right angle from that square, you get a cube. What do you get if you then go a right angle from a cube? It's called a tesseract. These are the levels of reality that we don't perceive, which is what we were discussing earlier on. The idea that there are deeper levels of reality that we are not programmed to see, because we're programmed to exist within this simulation. A few years ago, 2009, I was in the fortunate position of being asked to speak at the National Theatre in London before a production of Time and the Conways. And I stood and I gave a talk on time together with Jeff Forshaw. If anybody knows Jeff Forshaw, Professor Jeff Forshaw is Brian Cox's tutor, and he's written a series of books with him. Okay, that's a little aside. I sat having a cup of coffee with Brian at the University of Manchester a few years ago. And in the general conversation, he turned around and he said, of course we know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. So when you hear Brian Cox spouting off about how nonsensical it is to have extraordinary beliefs, Brian Cox actually used that quote in one of his books. And if you look at the latest Brian Cox book, it also turns around and it says everything that can happen does happen. This is Brian Cox. This is not the local nutter down the road. This is Brian Cox. This is how disingenuous they are and how they're in denial about the fact of what they know and what they don't know. What they don't know is breathtaking. 94% of the universe is missing. We don't know what the hell it is. We call it dark matter, dark energy. We've got no real idea. We just put the terms there because it's kind of convenient. It's like we don't know what hallucinations are. We just call things hallucinations. Nice little label, doesn't explain them. This is an hallucination. Everything we perceive is an hallucination. Okay, so one of the things they were trying to do was to try to show on stage. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Time in the Conways, but I strongly advise if you're interested in J.B. Priestley, my latest book is about J.B. Priestley and about his plays and how he's trying to put the philosophy along with his ideas. And what they did was they wanted to get the idea of how block time worked. And what they did was they had a group of actresses in a line and they had a strobe light. And the strobe light went on each actress and each actress was in a different position. And it was an amazing effect because you could see as if she was running, as she was moving. But of course, each of the actresses was static. The actresses were not moving. And this is how we perceive reality. I don't know how that was. No idea. That was the mystery slide. Oh, okay. Can I move into the next slide while you're doing that then? Yeah. Can you just move me on to the next one? Right, okay. So what am I leading up to here? Well, it's my concept I call cheating the ferryman. I don't know if any of you know, we did an event at the Dracolo Caves 3 weeks ago. Dracolo being locally here, where there's a load of caves down there that actually have 5 miles of tunnels. And we recreated Plato's cave in there with myself and a group of academics. And we actually tested people with something called the lucid light device and everything. T was there, and Natalie here was there as well. And it was an amazing event, wasn't it, how we actually got the ideas across. But what I was trying to do, though, is to show how perception and reality works, but also understanding a lot of the resonance of ancient Greek myths. And one of the ancient Greek myths involves when you die, what happens? And it says that when you die, the corpse, they place a little coin called an obolus underneath the tongue. Sometimes they might put it on the eyes of the corpse or underneath the tongue. The reason they did that was that the shade, who was the dead person, would then find themselves in front of a river, the Styx or the Acheron. And through the mists would come the ferryman. And the ferryman would take their oboli as payment and take them over to the land of the dead. I believe you cheat the ferryman. When you die, you cheat the ferryman. You do not pay him his obolus. Now, just going on a little bit further about this, in ancient Greek myth, and it was a subject that one of my previous speakers touched upon, there's a concept called anamnesis. Anamnesis is a Platonic term cited by Plato, and it's to do with the loss of forgetting. We are all suffering from amnesis. We don't know who we are. But when we have anamnesis, we remember what we really are. Okay? So, when they died, they were given the opportunity of staying in Hades, or the Elysian Fields, or going back and living their life again. And they were given a choice. But if they went back, they had to have all their memories wiped clean. So they'd start their life again, not remembering. Anybody who's an ancient Greek scholar will know what I'm talking about here is called Stoicism. The Stoics were the people who first came up with this idea, and it's also to do something called the eternal return or the eternal recurrence. Okay? It's deeply rooted in philosophy, it's deeply rooted in a lot of major religions. It's just people don't talk about it very much. So, you have the ferryman, and you cheat the ferryman, because you don't actually get to the point of giving him his oboli. So how does this work? Okay. I'm a member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. I was a professional member of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and in fact the first academic paper, well the only academic paper I've written, peer review, was actually published by their journal. And it's about cheating the ferryman. The idea is, when people have near-death experiences, what they do is they describe, don't they, the idea of, there are various things called moody traits to do with the near-death experience. We touched upon one of them earlier on, but I'll give a few of them. The idea of floating outside of your body. The idea of meeting another being, the being of light. The idea of time slowing down. The idea of what's called a panoramic life review. I saw my life flash before my eyes. When I was thinking about this, and I was doing the neurology, and doing the neurology of what takes place during the near-death experience, I discovered some extraordinary facts. For instance, the time slowing down probably is the release of a neurotransmitter called glutamate. I now believe it's endogenous dimethyltryptamine, but that's a whole new lecture, which I'm not going to touch on here. But I do in another lecture discuss how the pineal gland synthesizes melatonin into endogenous, that is metatonin, dimethyltryptamine. Okay? So, at the point of death then, when you have a near-death experience, you survive it. So your life passes before your eyes. What happens in a real death experience where you don't come back? Bear with me on this. Imagine a scenario that DMT is released in your brain at the point of death, and we know this happens, by the way. Recent discoveries, a lady called Jimo Borgigin at the University of Michigan, 3 years ago, actually found dimethyltryptamine in the brain, the pineal brains of live rats that they'd killed. They were alive, and then it was there, and then they managed to trace it. So dimethyltryptamine is in the brain. So if anybody turns around and says there's never found dimethyltryptamine in the brain, just point them to this paper before they start getting smart-arsed with you. Okay, so there you are, dimethyltryptamine releases, and anybody that knows dimethyltryptamine knows it's the most extraordinary substance. Okay, we won't go into details about it now, but imagine the scenario then that, like with ketamine, and ketamine is very similar in constituents to glutamate, the time slowing down. Imagine a scenario that the time starts to slow down as you're dying, but it slows down phenomenally. So the last split second of your life is not 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years, but 70 years or 60 years or whatever your previous lifespan has been before that incident. Suddenly you're in a completely different universe. You're in a universe of your own thoughts and your own ideas. And at the end of that second life, the same thing happens again. It's called Zeno's bisection paradox. So you're in smaller and smaller bits of time, but subjectively for you, you never reach the point of death. Somebody standing watching you die does that, but just like the hare never catches the tortoise, you never get to the point of death. You're in smaller and smaller bits of time. So what do you populate all that time with? Well, that's where you go into the simulation. That's where you start drawing up information. Initially, I did research to show that the human brain remembers everything. But I think it's more complex than that, because my initial position was that you live the same life over and over again. It's just you don't remember that you're living it again. It's very much what Nietzsche argued in The Gay Science. That's not what I suggest. I suggest you fall into a computer simulation of your own life. And you live your life again and again and again. The Russian edition of my book is actually called Groundhog Life, which I think is actually quite a good title, really. So the idea is that you live your life over and over again. But this time, just like a third-person computer simulation game, you know, when you start your game playing Tomb Raider, switch on the game, there's Lara Croft. She starts running down the corridor, and she goes into a room, and she gets killed. The game starts. Lara Croft is dead. But the game player isn't. The game player that carries the memory of the previous game is still alive, playing the game. So this time, the game player goes, right, okay, I now know a little bit about this world and this life. I know if I go in that room, I'm going to get killed. I want to make sure that Lara Croft's not going to go in that room. So what does the game player do? The game player tries to influence Lara in the simulation. Have you ever had these sensations in your life when something in your head says, do not do this? You meet somebody and you instantaneously know that they're bad for you or good for you. This is what I call your daemon. Your daemon is your game player. The term was referenced earlier on. I use the term specifically because it's from Gnosticism. The daemon is your guiding spirit, your guiding rule. But unlike your normal guiding spirit, I explain how your guiding spirit knows what you can do or not do, because it's lived your life before. So Lara Croft gets killed again, and it goes back again. So you can imagine over a period of time, just like a game player, you eventually get through the game. You eventually live the perfect life. This is what we're here to do. This is a simulation. Yes, simulation argument is fantastic, and it's all very interesting, but the reason why and the mechanism that is taking place here. In my books, I do the science of this. I don't just make these statements. I'm dealing with the work of people like Juan Maldacano. He's an Israeli scientist who's been doing the work on the holographic nature of reality. I'm doing the work of, citing the work of Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in Canada. These guys are trying to look for this pixelation of this reality. It is a well-known fact that the idea that this is a simulation is bandied around. But who's running the simulation? Again, you need to look into this because there's some quite interesting hypotheses put forward, and it's to do with Moore's law and it's to do with computing. The idea that if computers, Moore's law, Moore was the founder of Intel in the mid-60s, and he said that every 2 years, processing power would double. That's worked out pretty well. It's now moved to 3 years. So imagine in 200 years the processing power that we would have with computers. And of course, a computer doesn't need to be a thing on the box. A computer is anything that processes information. You could simulate a whole universe. And if you could simulate a whole universe, what would you populate that universe with if you were a future scientist or a future designer? You'd put Sims in there. You'd put Sims in there who'd actually lived their lives before. And then you'd watch what they do and see how they act. Everybody used to play the game The Sims a few years ago. We are in Second Life, if anybody remembers Second Life. Now imagine, finally, the scenario that I can download all your potential lives, and I can put them in a computer program. Then what I do is, I place you in a tactile feedback suit that you move, and the movement's like, you play virtual reality now, you can see your hands on the virtual reality scenario, you can move them and you can grab things and move them. When we were doing the seventh wave at Dracula Caves, we have something called seventh wave there. It's actually a profound virtual reality experience, whereby you actually see yourself in an out-of-body scenario. Okay? We can do this now. So there you are, you're in this scenario, and you have the feedback as you move in this reality, you move in the other reality. But then, imagine the scenario, you have amnesis, and all your past life memories are wiped clean, and you're born as a baby. And you start to live your life again. but there's part of you that remembers the past life. This is how precognition works. This is how déjà vu works. Déjà vu is literally what it feels like. You have lived this life before. If you do not get déjà vu sensations, and 30% of humanity don't, it means you're a virgin lifer. It means you're laying down the memories for the first time. Statistically, it has been analysed that the older you get, the less déjà vu sensations take place. That's because you've only got so far in the game, isn't it? Your daemon only knows as much as how far you got last time. So there's always going to be a point where your daemon doesn't have any more memories of what happened, because it's a new point. So this is how it works because, and in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, where I discuss about Alzheimer's and I discuss altered states of consciousness, I have evidence that people who have Alzheimer's start to have what's called super recurrent déjà vu sensations. People who have Alzheimer's start to déjà vu all the time. Because as they're getting older again, they're starting to prepare themselves for going back to start again. And that's how it works. And that's why young children, their doors of perception are open and they can remember their past lives slightly, but they also can see entities, they can see lots of things, they have mythical friends. And that's the subject of my next book, which I'm finishing the end of next week, where I deal with entities. And I deal with the science of entities, exactly what are entities and how we are perceiving them and how they're within the simulation. Now, hopefully, I've run to time. Yeah, very, very quickly, this is an interesting point. People turn around and say consciousness is in the brain. Cite this example to them. A guy called Tom Rat. They took planaria worms. Now, a planaria worm is quite interesting. You can cut its head off, and it will grow a new head. That was a planaria worm objecting. You take a planaria worm, and you cut its head off, it will grow a new head. What they did was, planaria worms really, really love raw liver. So what they did was, they took a load of planaria worms, and they put them in a petri dish. And there were planaria worms and they covered the petri dish with blue light. And planaria worms hate blue light for some reason. But certain planaria worms overcame their fear of blue light and went to the liver. I have? Oh, great. Okay, great. We've got more then. So the planaria worms, what they did was they cut their heads off. And they cut their heads off, and then new heads were grown. And then they put the planaria worms that had overcome their fear of the blue light into the petri dish. And all of them went to the liver. Which effectively means that with a completely new brain, where did that learning come from? How did the planaria worm know that? In exactly the same way that we know things from our own past lives. How we know things because we have cultural memories. There's been a series of experiments done with young fledgling birds. Birds just been born to come out the egg. If you actually go over the nest with a cardboard cutout of an eagle, the bird starts shivering and ducks down. How does it know that? It's never experienced anything. It's called morphic resonance. It's the kind of stuff that Rupert Sheldrake talks about. It's the idea that we carry within us, within our DNA, something deeply significant about who we are. Now, right, so that's William Blake. Now, because I've got half an hour here, so here's the idea. Again, I was talking about the game, because here we have Lara Croft and the daemon, the gameplay. So that explains all that, how that works. And again, it's interesting, you know, the idea, the simulation of the zeros and ones. Again, if anybody's interested in the latest research on this, they have discovered that information actually is physical. Get this, information is physical. There's been a series of experiments done to actually show this. And again, don't take my word for this. There is a guy called Vlatko Vedrell, who's professor of quantum physics at the University of Singapore. They show that it's physical. And also there's a guy called Gallimore, who literally 3 weeks ago brought out a new book on DMT. And in this he discusses the actual fact that information is physical. It gives off energy. Now, if it gives off energy, this means that digitized information cannot be destroyed. Because if you think about it, energy cannot be destroyed, is it? Second law of thermodynamics. It can be changed into something else, but it cannot be destroyed. So what happens if I throw a laptop or a mobile phone into a black hole? If the universe is enclosed, it means that information has been lost. That contravenes the second law of thermodynamics. And what the researchers are now saying is it's something to do with something called Hawking radiation. Round the edge of a black hole is an information field that contains the informational imprint of everything that's fallen into that black hole. So if a whole planet gets sucked into a black hole, or a whole solar system, it's not lost, it's turned into information, which is then smeared along what's called the event horizon. Not only that, they've extrapolated from this, and it was one of the last papers that Stephen Hawking wrote, and he wrote it with a guy called Frank Hartle of CERN. And they argued that, and Juan Maldacana's argued this as well, when the Big Bang took place, remember I said there was a point particle, and then suddenly you have this magical thing called superinflation. And modern science says that in the first billionth of a second, the universe expanded at some ridiculous rate. The only reason they've done that is to make the maths work. They've got no realization whether that happened or not. It's just the maths doesn't work, so they just create this little nonsense. But effectively, imagine the scenario then. It expands outwards, outwards, and outwards. What you're actually got is a huge sphere, and you're on the inside of it, if you're following me here. So the universe is expanding. What the universe is expanding to is magical, who knows. So imagine the inside edge of a huge sphere, which is the universe. They're arguing that it is peppered with what's called Planck square lengths. And each one of these Planck squares contains one bit of information. And they've done the calculation, and this is really intriguing, that if you calculate the present size of the universe, and you calculate that every Planck square at the edge of the universe contains one bit, it coincides completely with the amount of data that would be needed to create the universe as we believe it to be, which they say is almost definite proof that this is a simulation. Again, there's been various papers written on this over the years, but the guys you really want to follow up is Jacob Bekenstein. Because Jacob Bekenstein is the guy that's really pushing the envelope on this. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that we exist in a two-dimensional reality that we perceive as a three-dimensional reality. We feel it's three-dimensional. So remember I was talking before about distance and space? It's not there. And if we're in a two-dimensional reality, it means we can explain non-locality. Because everything is just enclosed in itself. Our brains are programmed to allow us to survive within this simulation. This is why we perceive what we do. Imagine a scenario that you can download all the information in the universe. Or even better, the idea. In fact, can I move on to my second one? Because we'll move on to this now, because this is the subject matter of my latest book, and I've still got 25 minutes, so... Because this is where I'm now going with the work. So that's the developing hypothesis. Sorry, the developing speculation. I'm not allowed to use the term hypothesis, nor theory, because I haven't tested it out under particular conditions. Okay. It's me again. Possibly.
Should be working. This one? So maybe it's my magic fingers again.
It's your magic fingers, yeah.
Must be. No, not in this scenario.
All right, okay. Could you just move them forward for me, then, do you think? My able assistant here. Right, okay. Can move on to the next one then? I'm sorry about this, but... Oh, no, it's just this... Okay, yeah. Can we move on to the next one so I know which one this is? Right, okay. Henri Bergson, same image that we looked at earlier on his phone. Quite synchronicity there. Okay, Henri Bergson was a French philosopher, and at the turn of the 19th century, he wrote a series of papers. And one of the things he was fascinated in was the nature of how our brains work and how we perceive things. And he argued that the brain acts as an attenuator. The brain does not give us all the information that's out there, because if it did, we'd be overpowered, because there's so much information out there. For example, there's something called, there are two effects that I find quite fascinating. The first one is the cocktail party effect. Have you heard of this? You're in a cocktail or a party, everybody's talking to everybody else, you're talking away to somebody else, somebody across the room mentions your name. You hear it straight away. That is because your brain is actually scanning at all times, it's just you or not. That's your daemon in action. It's your daemon scanning everything and watching everything. Another fascinating kind of fact that always intrigues me is how the brain buffers information. and it's intriguing. It's to do with, for instance, if you are in an underground garage and a car is less than 60 feet away and that car door is slammed, you will feel and see the sound and the car door slam at the same time. If it's further than 60 feet away, it might be 60 feet or 60 yards, suddenly there will be a mismatch, because of course the speed of light and the speed of sound are quite different. But the question is, why doesn't it occur less than 60 feet, 60 yards? And the reason is because your brain buffers the information to make you feel that everything's simultaneous. And that's happening all the time. Your brain is adapting the reality around you to make you feel that everything is happening now. But of course it isn't. There's something in the brain called the binding problem. The binding problem is how it all comes together in your head. There are different parts of your brain processing different things at the moment. And yet you have a feeling that everything's just happening now. And modern science has no answer to the binding problem at all. So if you ever want a neurologist to start panicking, just mention the binding problem to them and watch them start spitting into their beer because they have no answer for it. Okay? I think the answer is quite a simple one. I think what happens is the brain works non-locally. And not only that, I don't think the brain works on the neurons. We believe that the neurons are the things that are communicating with the brain. In my latest book, I actually argue it's something called the astroglial network. Do you know people turn around and say 10% of your brain is missing? You heard that phrase? Do you know what it means? Okay, the reason it is that 10% of your brain is made up of neurons. 90% of your brain is something called glial cells. Glial cells, they don't know what it's for. We talked earlier on about junk DNA. The glial cells in the brain are the equivalent of junk DNA. Now, nature doesn't waste time creating things. There has to be, it's doing something. The interesting point is glial is German for glue, because that's what they thought they were there to do, to glue the neurons in position. They now believe that there's something called the calcium wave that seems to act non-locally by crossing the brain instantaneously. And this is the glial cells communicating with each other. So really, the 90% of the brain that is actually missing is in fact your astroglial network. So this is, I think this is probably demonic consciousness versus eidolonic consciousness. Eidolonic consciousness, the idea of the person in the game, is your neurons. Your daemon works under the overall principle, holographically, of your whole brain. Okay? So, Bergson said, the brain is an attenuator, it cuts information out. And he argued, for instance, that if you're in the position of a caveman and you've got a saber-toothed tiger in front of you, there's no point in you knowing what everybody's talking about. You have to run. You have to get out of the way. And this is how the brain works to allow us to function in this simulation in the right way. Can we move on to the next one? Can we move on to the next one? Possible? Right. Aldous Huxley then, in 1954, wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. Anybody read it? Do so. Do so. Very important book. For instance, if you like the band The Doors, but I'm probably the only person old enough to probably remember The Doors, but Jim Morrison, they named his band after The Doors of Perception. And in fact, Jim Morrison, if anybody's interested, made a fantastic speech once, actually outlining my cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, back in 1970, 69, 1970. Pardon?
Outlining what hypothesis?
Cheating the Ferryman, the one I was talking about before. Of course, he wasn't really, but he was saying a similar kind of idea. So Aldous Huxley writes The Doors of Perception. This was his explanation of a series of experiences he had with mescaline that was brought down. He asked for some mescaline to be brought down to him by a guy called Humphrey Osmond, who was a British psychiatrist at this huge hospital in Saskatchewan. And he describes in the book his experiences. And he realized in the book, and he said, and he cites Blake, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it is, infinite. From the Auguries of Innocence, William Blake's poem. And this is again the idea, we are trapped within the caves of our cavern, and we cannot see the wider world. William Blake said this in the 18th century. And this is the point I'm trying to make here. Can we move on? Okay, so then we come across developing ideas. 1999, University of Arizona. There's a consciousness exhibition, conference that takes place every year. 1999, this young philosopher called David Chalmers stood up and said, we have two great problems with science. There's the easy problem, which is how the brain works and makes us move and everything else, but there's the hard problem of science. And the hard problem of science is, how does brain matter create consciousness? How is it that inanimate matter in your head, and when it comes down to it, that's all it is, it's inanimate matter reacting with electricity, creates your hopes, your dreams, your fears, and everything else. In one of my books I say, where does consciousness come? Is it just the addition of one molecule? Is there no consciousness and suddenly one molecule appears and suddenly, poof, you're there? Or is it gradual? And if you can have gradual consciousness, are we coming out like from sleep? How does it work? They still have no idea. They do not know, because if you think about it, atoms, we know that atoms are 99.9999999999999% empty space. Fact. And the things that are not empty space are quarks, which are infinitesimally small and are point particles. But there's solidity there. So what's going on? Why do you not fall through your chairs if it's all empty space? And people turn around to me and say that all the time. And it's nothing new. It's what Dr. Johnson said many, many years ago when he was trying to disprove the idea of this reality is not real. When he kicked a stone. It's called the reductum ad lapidem. He kicked a stone and said, I prove it's real. I dispute it thus, and kicked a stone. Absolute bloody idiot. The stone is actually made, if you break down the stone and what the stone would have been made of, it's still 99.999, etc. empty space. And the only reason his foot made contact with it, and the only reason your bottoms are you're not falling through the chair at the moment, is something called electrostatic repulsion. You are not touching, your bottom is not touching your seat. You are hovering above it. There is no contact. You are never in contact with anything in the external world. You never touch anything. And of course, if atoms are 99 point etc. empty space, what are you touching anyway? So this whole thing that we think is a physical something out there suddenly starts to dissolve. And this is leading edge quantum physics. There's nothing I'm telling you here that you won't find in any book on quantum physics. This is not new age waffle, this is technical fact. Okay? So, he's saying, how does this create it? So if we can move on to the next one. Okay, well, they believe that, where does consciousness come from? Well, there's an idea that consciousness exists out there. It's not in your brain is a receiver of consciousness. Because remember, we're all a singularity, as I said in the previous bit. We all are perceiving something and the brain is creating it around us. We are collapsing the wave function of reality. Again, as an aside, I'm going to run out of time, so I'll keep waffling until I run out of time. Does anybody know about what I mean by the collapse of the wave function? Okay. Subatomic particles, they are either waves or they are particles. And they don't know quite what they are. They're both. And the argument is that they choose to be a wave or a particle depending on what's observing them. Okay? There's been a series of experiments done which are absolutely uncanny. And if anybody's interested in checking out, the guy you need to talk to is a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. So there is a wave of, there's waves, but waves are weird. For instance, you have a wave in water, but that's a disturbance in the medium of water. But how does light waves travel the vacuum of space between the sun and the earth? They can't. And this was caused a great problem in science in the late 19th century, because of course a wave needs a medium to be in. So this is why they turned around and they said subatomic particles are actually particles, and particles can travel through. But we have a problem. Light is the same. It's a particle and a wave, depending on when you look at it. Then Max Born, who, funnily enough, I actually discovered only recently, Max Born was the great-grandfather of Olivia Newton-John. I didn't know that. But anyway, if you've never heard of Max Born, it doesn't matter anyway. But Max Born was one of the leading researchers of quantum physics in the 1930s. And he came up with this brilliant idea that we're not talking about an actual physical wave. We're talking about a statistical wave, like a crime wave, that you might find a particle in one place or another place. But it's your act of measurement or your act of observation that collapses a wave function where the particle can be anywhere in the universe, and you, by observing it or measuring it, collapse that particle, be just there. Now, multiply that up to all the particles in the universe. Suddenly, we are creating our universe around us. Suddenly, from what my other speakers said earlier on, suddenly the science is proving it. This is, again, if you want a quantum physicist to spit in his drink. Talk about wave-particle duality to him. And they'll look and they'll pretend, and they will waffle, and they'll say, oh no, it's to do with the act of measurement. No, it's not. It's not specifically at all to do with the act of measurement. There's a lot of quantum physicists now that are being very, very brave here. And they're saying it's consciousness that actually creates the wave function. Okay, can we move on? Okay, right, we've got 10 minutes. Right, we're going to get really, really into really interesting stuff now. Anybody heard of OR? Orchestrated objective reduction. Do you remember I said in 1999 that Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona and made this speech? Two people in the audience was a guy called Stuart Hamerhoff. Can we move to the next one? Next one, please. Yeah, okay. There were two people in the audience. Stuart Hamerhoff, who was an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, and a guy called Dr. Roger Penrose, who's one of Britain's leading mathematicians. He's the Raspall Professor of Maths, or he was. He's now an emeritus professor. Hamerhoff is an anesthesiologist, and he's fascinated by one crucial fact about being a professor of anesthesiology. Anesthesiologists have not got a clue how anesthetics work on the brain. They know what they do, but they don't know how. Has anybody ever had an operation where you actually have a general anesthetic? You're gone, aren't you? Bang, you're gone, and you're back again. Your consciousness has been switched off. But the mechanism by which they do it, they have no idea. So Hamerhoff started researching on this, and with Stuart Penrose, they came up with something called orchestrated objective reduction. Can we move on to the next one, please? Okay, because if you look at your neurons, there are literally, they're structured, the neurons themselves are built out of tiny things called, tiny structures of tubulin, called microtubules. Millions and millions and millions of them in each neuron. They believe, can we go back one? Okay. They believe, well, they don't believe, they've done the experiments. These things give off single pulses of light. And the single pulses of light go inwards like this. And they cause what's called interference patterns within the neurons of your brain. Now, anybody who knows about holography knows that that's what a hologram is. It's an interference pattern. So is this what this reality is? It's your neurons creating billions and billions of these little interference patterns which creates this reality around you. Okay? Again, this is science. This is not nonsense. Okay, can we move on then? Now, when you get Alzheimer's disease, my mother died of Alzheimer's disease last year. You watch them go, you watch them fade, you watch their memories disappear. You know what's happening? The microtubules are being blown up. The microtubules are being shattered by things called amyloid plaques. And these destroy your brain's ability to attune into the field. It's like you take a back of an old valve radio and you start smashing the valves. This is what's happening in Alzheimer's. Okay, can we move on again? Michael Persinger, no, let's move on from Michael Persinger. Right, anybody had sleep paralysis? Okay, do you know what sleep paralysis actually is, the technical what's happening? Okay, when you're sleeping and you're having a dream and you're having a fight, your body's likely to move to copy what you're doing in the dream. To stop you doing that, there's an override mechanism in the brain which semi-paralyzes you to stop you enacting your dream so you don't damage yourself or your partner or whatever. But sometimes you can become aware and conscious while you're in this paralyzed state. When you do so, you feel you cannot move. You feel you're trapped inside your body. Okay? Now, that is intriguing in itself, but it also means you're in a liminal state of consciousness. You're in a state of what's called hypnagogia or hypnopompia, which means that your dream images are pulling through into this reality. Suddenly you see things in the room. You see what's called the hag, which will be a kind of cowled figure in the corner, or you'll have a sensation of somebody sitting on your chest. That's the technical information answer for it. But I think there's more to that. Can we move on? My mother. Okay, if anybody's interested in UFOs, you're going to love this one. Okay, my mother, one day, she was in her late 80s, and she phones me up, and she said, Tony, something really weird happened yesterday. I was walking onto our local village with your aunt, and I saw an object flying above Price's factory. And she said it was a smoke disc. And she said, I watched it revolve, and I watched it shoot off towards North Wales. Tony, what did I see? My mother's not interested in UFOs, she never has been. So I turned around and I said, oh, it was probably your eyes. She was partially sighted. She'd lost an eye with malignant melanoma and everything else. So I said, your eyes were just playing up. 3 days later, she phones me up, terrified, one morning. She is absolutely terrified. And I said, Mum, what's wrong? And she said, oh my God, what happened last night? And I said, what? She said, because she lives alone, she's a widow. She woke up in the middle of the night in a state of sleep paralysis. And this is how she described it. She said, I couldn't move, and I was looking towards the door of my bedroom, and my bedroom door was open. And I couldn't move, and then suddenly I watched as 3 spindly fingers came round the corner of the bedroom, the door, and this little creature with huge black eyes poked round the door, looked at me, and dodged back again. Tony, what the hell did I see? Now, my mother wouldn't know a classic grave had bit her on the backside. But she saw something, okay? And it was a classic grey. Can we move on? This is what children see. Can we move on again? Okay, anybody heard of Charles Bonnet syndrome? Okay, Charles Bonnet syndrome was discovered by Charles Bonnet. It's amazing how these people get named after the same things, isn't it? Who, his father, Charles Lewin, started seeing things. And he explained he would see people turning up with tall hats, and they were everywhere. And he was so fascinated with this, he researched it. And when my mother started these things, I realized that she was developing Charles Bonnet syndrome. It's to do with people with partially sighted. They start to make up things, and their brain supposedly makes up things that their mind can't make up. And I realized this one day, because my mother turned around to me one day, I went to see her, and she's talking to me, and she goes, she said, the children aren't singing as much as they used to. And I said, what children? And she said, the children that go round with me when I'm shopping. And I said, what children? She said, well, they're not really children, they're kind of little people. And they have this kind of ringing sound like bells, and they're singing. And she said, but they're not as friendly as the old man in the kitchen. And I went, oh, which old man is this, Mum? Oh, there's an old man in the kitchen. He always smiles at me and nods when I'm in the kitchen. So I immediately realised that she was developing Charles Bonnet syndrome. But the question I ask, and this is the question that I'm doing in my new book, is what are these entities? To say that they are hallucinations is no answer. Why was my mother's brain creating archetypes of aliens? What were these little creatures she was seeing? Can we move on? Sleep paralysis with children. Move on again. These are drawings that children have done of their own sleep paralysis scenarios. What's that? Next one. What are these? We talk about children having these kind of weird childhood friends, mythical friends. A guy called Halliwell has written a book on it called Invisikids, Invisible Friends. This is because their doors of perception, young children, are open. They have gone round my cheating the ferryman, and they're living their life again, but because of the way the brain is for young children, because I've done the research on this, I believe why they see these things is to do with the myelination of the neurons. Young children, up to year 8 or 9, your neurons aren't insulated. There's no insulation for them, which means that information can get in and out much more quickly. This is why children see the things they do. And it starts again with old people. And old people start to have the same thing. I also think with children, it's to do with something called the corpus callosum, which is the unit that holds the 2 parts of your brain together. It's not fully developed in young children. And I believe this is where the doors of perception are starting to open with young children. Right, we've got 2 minutes. Can we move on to the next one? Okay, just more. These are things that, that's the corpus callosum. Move on again. Barry Weisberg, quite fascinating. Something called retrogenesis. And I'll leave you with this when I said about young children and old people. Can we move on to the next one? This is what he says. And I noticed this with my mother. When a child is born, they develop certain things as they get to the fully developed. One of the things is called the Babinski stimulation. If you take a baby's foot and you stroke it, the baby's foot will curl around like that. I'm never sure it's like that or like that. When you're an adult, that doesn't happen. The opposite happens. Until you get to people who've got Alzheimer's disease and they're dying of it. And I tried this with my mother in the final few weeks of her life. I tickled her foot. The Babinski contract was like a child, like an infant. Have you ever noticed how people get old? They go into a fetal position. They get smaller. They start to look as if they're a child. That is because they are. The point is so bloody obvious. that the people are missing the obvious. There's an overlap between the lives, particularly with people with Alzheimer's, and they start, their next life is overlapped with this one. And they slowly go and they disappear from our life to be born again. One final point I'll make now, which is again an aside of this, and this and then we'll stop, because once you get me started I won't stop. Has anybody heard something called the nectar of transcendence? Okay. It's something that Indians do in India, and people who do yoga talk about. It's a taste at the back of the throat that people have when they go into altered states of consciousness. This is intriguing. The reason being that at the 49th day of gestation, no, before that, there's a process they use in India called Kakara Mudra, where they train themselves to put the tongue at the back of the throat so they can taste this. So you've heard of this, yeah? Why do they do it? Well, they do it for this reason. On the 49th day of gestation, when the baby's in the womb, this is when the Buddhists believe that consciousness comes in. The pineal gland and the pituitary gland at the back of the throat. Then they start to move up slowly from the back of the throat to the centre of the brain, where they split up into the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. They leave a very tiny little cleft, called Refke's pouch. And that leads right up to the pineal gland. Now, if the pineal gland is, as I believe it, something that creates melatonin and then changes the melatonin into dimethyltryptamine, the stuff that they're tasting at the back of their throat is dripping down from the pineal gland. And it's going into the back of the throat, and that's what they're doing, that's what they're tasting. It's pure dimethyltryptamine. And I'm intending to see if we can actually do some kind of work on people when they redo this. And this is our reality simulator. As Rick Strassman, if anybody's read the Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman, this is what he's talking about. Our reality simulator is dimethyltryptamine. This is a dimethyltryptamine hallucination, and we're within it. And anybody who takes DMT will tell you that as soon as you take DMT and you go into the DMT world, you realise that this is the simulation, this is the dream world. DMT is not. One of my associates, the people I work with, the people who are involved in the Drakelow Caves, one of them is involved, they're doing research at the moment on DMT. I think it's Goldsmiths College, or it could be Imperial in London. Completely legal. And one of the guys told me, and I'll leave you with this, he turned around and he said the first time he took DMT, he took it intravenously, he's out of his body, and he finds himself something called the DMT cage, which is a kind of a reality that you're in, you're floating in space. And he said it was like a cage around him, but because you have this kind of wider vision, he saw an entity, a being, come up to the cage and rattle it and look at him. And the being turned around and said, "Why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this. This is not the way to get to us. This is not the way you do it. Do not do this." And then disappeared, and he came through, and he said, "I've just had the most weird, this entity spoke to me." 2 weeks later, he takes the DMT again. He goes back, he's in the DMT cage. He's sitting there, and then suddenly, bang, bang, bang. "I told you last time, you do not do it this way." What does that tell us? Thank you.
Wow.